listener production.
Hey, Chris Beery with you and welcome to The Briefing. We're under surveillance everywhere we go, from CCTV as we're walking down the street, at a footy match, or simply just buying our groceries. But there's a new type of invisible and powerful surveillance that you probably don't know about, and that's genetic surveillance. In the second half of this episode, you'll hear from a Melbourne lawyer on just how dangerous this is, and at the rate we're going, every single Australian will be identifiable through a DNA database within the next 12 years. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy. It's Thursday, the 10th of April.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, everyone, and happy Thursday. And oh my gosh, Chris, look, sometimes we love to hate social media. We use it too much. I get it. But gosh, sometimes does it deliver?
A spoonful of tariffs makes the stock market go down. The stock market go down. The stock market go down. A spoonful of tariffs makes the stock market go down in the most delightful way.
Oh, wow, that is brilliant.
And it looks as though Donald Trump has listened to the world, social media sphere, our global leaders, whatever, at last. Because in some breaking news, as we record this morning, Mr. Trump has announced a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs that had just been slapped on various countries across the globe. The US president says all countries except China will now temporarily, remember, 90 days, be subject to the same 10% baseline tariff, the same one that Australia is currently facing.
Yeah, now to be clear, we're just talking about the extra tariffs that were added on in recent days, not the long list of countries and original reciprocal tariffs that were announced last month. So that includes those things on steel and aluminium that we copped. In a post shared on Truth Social, Trump wrote that 75 countries had called his representatives to negotiate a solution, also saying they will be postponed because they didn't retaliate in any way, shape or form. And something along the lines of, like I warned them not to. So, he's chalking this up as a win for himself. While pausing these tariffs, he announced a further 125% tariff on China, Tara. Yes. He says that's because they retaliated to his retaliatory tariffs, with some experts raising concerns that Australia could get caught in the crossfire here. If you do want to find out a little bit more about what these rising tensions between China and the US economically mean for us, we have a deep dive. I'm going to pop that into the show notes.
Yeah, and look, it's because the thought is that China might then look to other nations like Australia to try and get the products that it previously would have relied on the US for. Others have said that it may mean that there's some cheap goods that become available to Aussies that would usually be sold in the US. So some might see that as a win, but for Aussie manufacturers, that's very unlikely to be, as they would struggle to compete. I don't know why I have Albo in my ear here going, buy Australian, yeah. Support our Aussie businesses. And also, just on the comment Trump made, he's really trying to send a strong message there clearly to countries around the world, but at least it was a little bit more collegial and polite to the way he explained it a few days prior, where he said world leaders were calling him to, quote, kiss my ass to desperately try reduce the levies.
Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir.
Oh my gosh. Okay, Oliver Twist is getting a run in US politics. Interesting.
Yeah, and look, in that same period, there were comments made again from Trump about wanting to target pharmaceuticals, but our PM has again stressed to Aussies we won't be pandering to the US over the PBS. It won't be an area that he's willing to bend in a bid to strike a deal.
Speaking of all things tariffs and money, our Treasurer and Shadow Treasurer faced off in their first debate last night. Chalmers and Angus Taylor were hosted by Sky News for their hour-long debate, which was dominated mostly by the policies of the man we were just speaking about, who doesn't happen to live or lead this country, Tara. Donald Trump. The Treasurer saying Labor is best placed to deal with all this global uncertainty, and take a shot every time that phrase gets thrown around. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor saying the Coalition are the best economic managers who can save us from a recession, while the Treasurer says Labor is best placed to deal with all this global uncertainty. Take a shot every time that phrase gets thrown around.
We've got an opposition leader and an opposition, which is absolutely full of these kind of doji sycophants who have hitched their wagon to American-style slogans and policies and especially cuts. which would make Australians worse off.
And as for their plan to immediately ease cost of living pressures, they both gave us a good summary of what we already knew. Chalmers pointing to Labor's promised boost in Medicare funding, cheaper medicines, wiping of 20% from existing student debt and their minor tax cuts, while Taylor spruiked the Coalition's $50 million commitment to Food Bank, 25-cent petrol promise, pumping more Aussie gas into the market, and cutting red tape and waste, not essential services, to strengthen the economy. And now for those who left Monday night's debate between the PM and Peter Dutton a little bit bored, I'm looking at you, Chris. This one brought a little bit of spice.
Angus is going to the election with three policies. First of all, to increase income taxes on every Australian taxpayer. Second of all, lower wages. And thirdly, secret cuts to pay for nuclear reactors. And you can't find $600 billion to pay for those nuclear reactors without coming after Medicare, just like Peter Dutton did when he was the health minister.
All right, now I'm going to move on.
Can I just respond to that, Ross? Because there's complete nonsense again from Jim, and he really should stick with the facts. The only energy plan that's going to cost $600 billion is your energy plan. There will be lower taxes.
Just made up that.
There will be lower taxes under a Dutton government. A lower fuel tax, 25 cents off at the Bowser immediately for every Australian who buys fuel at the Bowser. And you might dismiss that. You might think that's irrelevant, but let me tell you.
You said you're going to increase income taxes
in my part of the world,
taxpayers.
Reducing fuel taxes.
That's his policy.
Is real, it's relevant, and it's immediate, unlike your 70 cents a day in 15 months' time.
Yeah, so the two of them getting into a little bit of an argy-bargy then. That happened quite a few times throughout the debate. Look, I will say, while Angus Taylor did a pretty good job at pointing out how living standards have declined and the cost of living and everything is up under Labor, he didn't do a good job at shutting down those big, bold statements from Chalmers. Like we heard there about the secret cuts, that was something that got thrown around a lot because at the end of the day, the Coalition are going to the polls on this promise that they're going to make cuts, but they're not spelling out exactly from where they're going to come from. Even in terms of the public service, he didn't have an answer last night about which departments will be affected, which particular workers will be affected, which is a key criticism of the Coalition at the moment. And it really feeds into this narrative that they're just appearing as a little disorganised and a little unsure of their own policies within the party. But look, with that all said, it is week 2 of the campaign. We have just over 20 days until this election, so let's see if they can turn it around.
Changing pace now, Australia and Canada have acted quickly to remove a game which encourages rape, incest, and tells players to be women's worst nightmare and never take no for an answer. The game named No Mercy is available on the world's largest PC gaming platform, Steam, launching there last month, with a number of other countries now being pressured to follow in Australia and Canada's footsteps. The game does require a card to purchase and has age verification checks, but some campaigners have argued that it still could be downloaded by kids, saying that parents might assume that the platform is moderated and would have appropriate checks and balances in place due to how widely it's used.
Yeah, this story is, to be honest, incredibly shocking, and I would genuinely love to know who's actually spending their time making these games, but also playing these games. And I know that, some of the counter arguments around games like this is that, it's not the whole purpose of the game. It's, the side quests, it's an option. But not to be too judgy, but why is that something that you're wanting to do as a player, as a gamer? And I mean, the harm for kids is that they think it's just this silly little thing. They don't see the nuance to it and how problematic it really is, I don't think. I don't think there's an argument in any way, shape or form that should ever be something that is able to be done on a platform. What are we teaching anybody? Yeah.
It's just perpetuating that kind of thinking. We've just seen series like Adolescence go global, and this is just another example of, if we're just talking about kids and teens here, why it's so important for parents to be across what they're doing online and not assume they're safe. And look, I might be sounding like my ex-police officer dad here, but cyber safety experts and child protection experts in law enforcement who I've interviewed over the years have continuously given the advice around that they would never allow their children to use devices on their own in their rooms because of issues like this. And gosh, I feel like I'm going to be the biggest helicopter parent one day, Chris.
Yeah, but to be fair, it's for really good reason. This isn't just, cracking down on kids for the sake of cracking down on kids. This is something that has, tangible impacts. And yeah, right, I'm happy that our country stepped in to do the right thing here and that this is banned.
Yeah, and look, it's not just about kids. This is also generally about adults as well. We have a national issue with domestic and sexual violence against women being sexually assaulted and killed at horrifying rates. The issue is only getting worse. And I just remember in Queensland alone, our outgoing police commissioner last year said DV had gone up just 20% post the pandemic to rates we have never seen before, and said it's by far the biggest issue facing police. All of these issues are interrelated. We really need to see action from governments and related sectors and the community all working to kind of stamp these attitudes out.
But if I'd call out to mum rather than mum, like other kids, I would go, mum, instead of mum.
And if you didn't recognise that voice, maybe this will help you.
My name is Greg Gregson. But the kids at school call me Mr. G.
Yes, the infamous and controversial TV character Mr. G is back. Aussie comedian and actor Chris Lilly has been hinting at a possible return for the colourful drama teacher, last night confirming it in a video featuring the character adjusting his tie and gyrating a medicine ball. Mr. G first hit Aussie screens back in 2007 when the ABC first aired Summer Heights High. It is not yet known in what capacity Mr. G will be returning, and I'll be honest, I'm a little surprised that he is.
Yeah, well, because in 2021, his shows were removed from Netflix in Australia and New Zealand, and that was largely around the controversy around some of his characters, because there was one where he appeared in blackface and he regularly would kind of embody these characters from different cultural backgrounds. We remember there was Jonah from Tonga, there was a Japanese mother and a manager of a skateboarding superstar. But I guess maybe the argument is that Mr. G, if it's just focusing on Mr. G, is probably the least problematic of the characters. And he was definitely popular at the same time. So perhaps they'll bring it back and just rein it in a little. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when he dropped that Netflix series Lunatics in 2019, a lot of the criticism from fans was that it was watered down and ultimately I hate saying this, but it just wasn't funny. It was not funny. So we'll see. Like I said, I'm surprised that he's bringing it back. I think it is a brave choice. I will be honest, a little part of me is, that nostalgic part of my brain is going, yay, yippee. But I'm also like, oh, let's see what he creates with this character in 2025.
Yes, and that brings us to the end of our headlines today. Coming up next, you'll find out all about this new frontier on how we're being watched, but not through things like CCTV, rather genetic surveillance. That's coming up next in our deep dive.
DNA databases are expanding rapidly worldwide. This ranges from commercial DNA databases, where any of us can send off our spit for testing to find out more about our family tree, to police databases used to identify criminals, missing people, and unidentified bodies. Right now, the Australian Police DNA database currently holds almost 2 million profiles, but a technique called familial searching means those not in the database can also be identified, and innocent families can end up caught in an investigation. Felix Ralph is a Melbourne-based criminal defence lawyer who's written about this concerning concept and the lack of legislation around it in a paper 7 years ago called Conviction Through Kith and Kin. Felix, we've recently heard the news about 23andMe filing for bankruptcy with questions around what happens to their 14 million customer profiles and data that's kind of swirling around. Who do you think could get access to it?
I got to admit, my first thought was some sort of Elon Musk type character, I have to say. Honestly, who knows? It's gone to bankruptcy court. It's in the American system. When this was originally developed, they had no idea about, or I think they had some of an idea, but about the power of these DNA databases and what they were going to look like. I think people are starting to become a little bit more educated as to what they are and the impact and what the likely future is going to look like. But that 23andMe story is a bit wild when you look at it from a criminal defence lawyer's point of view.
Do you think someone like the police should buy it?
Or no, not really. A lot of people don't realise when they send in their DNA sample via the mail that the consequences can actually be drastic. You can put your relatives close or long lost under police investigation, even though they might be innocent. I think any possession of such a significant amount of DNA samples should be highly regulated and not fall into the hands of the state. The problem with all of this is that the technology is increasing so rapidly. The sophistication of the DNA testing is increasing rapidly and the cost of it is going down. So when you're talking about a DNA sample size of 1 or 2 million people, you're actually talking about 8 to 10 million people because of the genetic interrelatedness. It's basically like Jerry Springer, where you find out who the real father is or something, but it's on a systemic level. So if the police or if the state had access to it or owned it, we're really sort of marching towards a genetic surveillance type situation, which makes me slightly uncomfortable, very uncomfortable.
Let's jump into familial searching. What is it and how many people can be identified using familial searching in the database?
So about 5.8 million people in Australia are able to be sort of found through this sort of technique of familial searching or familial matching, because we share our DNA with our mum, our dad, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunties, cousins, second cousins, it goes on and on and on. At the moment, about 5.8, but that's a very rough calculation. And in about 9 to 12 years, I think it'll be the entirety of the Australian population will be able to be found through the DNA database. Because once you have it forever, and you can track people's genetic relatedness through time.
Yeah, and what are your concerns with the way familial searching is being used in Australia?
The concerns are that it's basically completely unregulated. I first started looking into this in about 2014, and I thought, the government will start to regulate in relation to this, but it hasn't, and it's been 10 years. And there are, I don't want to be negative about familial searching or familial matching. There are some really legitimate uses and really, absolutely amazing cases, cold cases solved through familial searching. Familial searching casts the net towards your whole family and it generates leads, but there can only be one person or whoever commits the crime. There can only be 1 or 2 people who commit that crime. But everyone in your family is subject to searching. And the other thing as well is that it's called parallel construction. It's basically where you're investigated for a crime that may or may not exist or is relatively minor in order to get the DNA of your, of a brother or a sister or a great uncle or something like that. And we're already starting to see that happening. And that's extremely concerning because you could just be brought in for really no reason whatsoever, subject to a DNA test if it's not on the database. And then they use it. The real reason is completely obscured to you. You have no idea why.
So how has familial searching changed policing already?
It's really at the cutting edge of policing at this point in time. There hasn't been widespread changes to policing, but it's certainly changed investigations as it relates to cold cases. The most concerning aspect of it is the future, which it could radically change, where there does exist a very, very strong possibility or likelihood that instead of giving your driver's license when pulled up by the police, you just provide your DNA and then it's ran through the search on a phone or an iPad or something like that, because the technology is certainly there to do that. And we're constructing this giant DNA database, which is, I think the term that I use is kind of like an all-seeing eye of Sauron, just kind of scanning everyone. So that's really the main concern. But it doesn't seem like our legislators have really considered that, which is a little bit concerning.
Yeah, so should we be worried that these techniques are eroding the presumption of innocence?
Yes, and also privacy. The presumption of innocence, it's a difficult thing because it would exclude a lot of people because DNA is science. Like if your DNA is on a murder weapon and you're the only contributor to that murder weapon, that is a very, very strong indicia of guilt. But it's when you have system-wide surveillance of our most private information that we could possibly have. It literally is who we are and what makes us who we are. It should be reserved for the most serious of crimes. It should be reserved for crimes where all other investigative methods have failed, and it's not just a shop theft or a bicycle theft or some sort of minor property crime. It should be reserved for serious cold case murders. But at this point in time, we don't have that legislation or regulation to determine, well, what's an appropriate thing to use this really powerful technology for and what's not.
So how does someone's DNA profile end up on a national database?
That's a very interesting question. A couple of years ago, it used to be upon a finding of guilt, and that used to be ordered by a magistrate. And it could be for a really, really low-level finding of guilt. I remember a couple of years ago, I used to resist DNA applications for kids who had stolen. There was one kid who'd stolen a bicycle. Like, do you really need to go on a national crime database for a kid stealing a bicycle? But that is actually lowered. The test is lowered. So it's no longer placed before the courts to go on the database. It's just done at the station level. So a sergeant can authorise the taking of a DNA sample. But the core point is that once you get to a critical mass of people in the database, everyone's able to be found on the database. Kind of think about it like when you do a search, a little light pops up and that illuminates exactly who you're related to. That's the network effect of a database, and that's the thing that should be concerning. Because the DNA database was originally created for a really legitimate purpose, which is the detection of past and future crime for people who have committed those crimes. But now it's kind of transforming, and the function is creeping to there's that aspect to it, which has been discussed and legislated, and it literally has criminal profiles, DNA profiles on there. And it's morphed to, there's that, and then also the entire family of the person on that database, which is the concerning aspect for me from a civil liberties point of view and a privacy point of view.
Yeah, for sure. A question that, often comes back and around is, if you have nothing to hide, why should you fear these techniques? What do you say to that?
I would say that that's a really silly thing, because secondary transference or DNA transference is, you can't control where your DNA is. As soon as you walk into a room, your DNA will be shed into that room, and who knows what happens into that room further on. It's not that you've got nothing to hide. It's the fact that you can't hide it. You can't hide where your DNA has been. Everywhere you go, your DNA is shed like little microscopic indicia of what you've done. And you can't control how that transference has gone through. And there's been lots of cases where people have been actually imprisoned and then found innocent due to investigative issues and transference, which is a massive problem in the criminal defence and the criminal justice system.
Okay, so there is a lot going on in this space right now. Can you give me your top things that you would like to see changed in this DNA world?
I just want to see the legislature think about this, and the people to kind of debate whether they want to have widespread genetic surveillance, because at this point in time, there is no legislation that talks about this whatsoever. And we're walking towards a situation where everyone is going to be able to be monitored at all times through their genetic relatedness. And I think that just needs to be discussed because it affects us all. Within 9 to 12 years, my estimate is that everyone will be illuminated through DNA familial searching. And is that something that you really want to happen? Every time that you are pulled over by a booze bus or searched, you have to offer up your DNA. That situation is a bit wild to me, and I think it needs to be regulated. And then to avoid things like this 23andMe, where huge amounts of samples are just up in the air, what's going to happen to them? It needs to be regulated. It needs to be considered by our lawmakers and discussed widely, which is why I'm on this show and talking about it and hoping to prompt some discussion.
How could a situation like the 23andMe hack and sale lead to genetic surveillance?
I think if a bad actor with 100 million could purchase 23andMe, with the increased ease of genetic testing, you could have a extremely powerful tool to do some pretty concerning things. If the state had it, then you could have a tool to monitor the movement of a significant portion of the US population. Once you start dealing with databases and network effects and then the increased sophistication of technology, it's really a nebulous kind of futuristic Gattaca type situation where it's best to avoid. It's best to not open that Pandora's box because it has the capacity to seriously undermine people's rights.
Well, Felix, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
No worries.
That was Felix Ralph, Melbourne-based criminal defence lawyer there. Before you go, though, if you liked this ep, you can subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcast from. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.